Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? School vaccine requirements, or yes, call them mandates. It's been the backbone of America's public health system. Those requirements in every state that a child must have had their routine vaccinations to attend public school. A system that has operated beneath the surface for decades, driving up vaccination rates in America. But just a few weeks ago, Florida stepped forward to say no more, saying parents must have control over what goes into their child's body, period. On today's episode, we're going to have an honest, maybe uncomfortable discussion about whether we're asking the right questions when it comes to these mandates. Is this where public health should hold the line? Or is there another way, another approach that values individualized decision-making without toppling a system that's protected America for decades? Our guest today, Jennifer Reich, author of Calling the Shots, the piercing book that gets to the heart of this entire matter, why some parents do not want to vaccinate, and where that is leading us as a nation. Let's get started. Welcome, everybody.
Hey, everybody.
Hi, guys.
We have a super spicy topic today. Ever since Florida got rid of its school requirements that all parents must have their kids vaccinated in order to attend school, we knew we were going to get deep into this subject, and we're really happy to say we've got someone who can help us go there today. But first, who are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
Yeah, I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark.
Yeah, and with this being a show all about the breakdown in trust in science and medicine and public health, it's not a shock, as Brenda says, that we've been touching this Florida announcement in various episodes for weeks now. You know, that's because it really crystallizes the moment we're in. This is really one of the places where public health touches people's lives. And if this goes down, we're in a whole new world.
Yeah. Look, it feels like we're crossing a Rubicon, that there isn't going to be just one approach anymore to vaccines. We're not all going to be rowing in the same direction. And I am so thrilled that Jennifer Reich is going to be joining us on this show. I got to just tell you, if there is an author crush or like a public health crush that I have had for the last 11 months, it's on Jennifer Reich. The book she wrote, Calling the Shots, it freaking blew my mind. I mean, the way that she approaches it, for our Maha listeners who are listening right now, I will tell you, you need to read this book. It is inviting, it is empathetic, it is deeply understanding of where people are coming from. It is not preachy or condescending. I learned a lot. So dang, I am really excited to have Jennifer Reich on this program. But Tom, let's first dive in and get our heads around these school requirements. Where are we with them, and how did we get to where we are today?
Yeah, I'm still processing the term public health crush. I've never heard that before, but it's fitting. So when we talk about the state issuing a vaccine mandate, where does that power come from? And for that, we head back to a guy named Hendrik Jacobson, who was a pastor in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was 1902. And there was a smallpox outbreak. And the city passed an ordinance requiring everyone to get vaccinated or face a $5 fine. And Jacobson, who was a local pastor, refused. And some historians have said that he was worried about vaccine safety, but for sure, he argued that the mandating this vaccine violated his personal liberty. And that led to a landmark Supreme Court case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts with a ruling in 1905. And Jacobson loses that case. And the Supreme Court rules that the states have the constitutional authority to enforce mandatory vaccination laws as a reasonable exercise of their power to protect public health and safety. So in other words, individual liberties may be limited some when it's deemed necessary by a state with the guidance of its health experts to prevent harm to others. And with that, we really have like this foundation of modern public health law. And flash forward 20 years to 1922, the Supreme Court gets specific about it, and specific about this topic that we're talking about today of school mandates. And that's the Zuck versus King case. And the court upheld a city's right to exclude unvaccinated children from schools. And so for the rest of the 20th century, and as we turn the corner into the 21st century, things were fairly copacetic. American law generally deferred to public health expertise. But as we enter this century, that approach begins to get challenged. We'll sort of get into all that. But taking us to 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, there's one notable quote that I want to read, which was Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, and he's speaking to the Federalist Society. And he says, it's important to keep Jacobson, that Supreme Court case that we just talked about, it's important to keep Jacobson in perspective. And he goes on to say, it does not mean that whenever there's an emergency, executive officials have unlimited, unreviewable discretion. So it kind of sounds like he's thinking about this long held precedent, which really sets up the framework for school vaccine requirements. And he's thinking about its limits.
Yeah, Tom, I'm thinking about that $5 fine. And like in today's terms, that's like $200.
Yeah.
But back to health. We have to remember that a lot of things happened in the last 100 years. At the start of the 20th century, like 125 years ago, when the Supreme Court gave states the power to curb some of these liberties to keep us all safe and to keep the community safe, there wasn't a lot of advancements in infectious disease. We were still kind of in like the dark ages. I mean, infectious disease was rampant and death was common from infectious diseases. And then in the first half of the 20th century, we had lots of advances. It wasn't just immunizations. We had sanitation, clean drinking water, and antibiotics. And with all of those, we had improvements in the death rates from infectious diseases. And we saw the rates plummet. But then as we hit the second half of the century, so we're talking like the early 1960s, measles, it was still infecting 3 to 4 million Americans a year. We talked about this before. We had like 50,000 people were going to the hospitals, and we had thousands of people suffering serious complications. We heard about that dreadful brain swelling, and, it killed around 500 Americans. And then we had a big moment in 1963. The measles vaccine was rolled out. And pretty quickly, we're talking a few years to maybe a decade, the infections dropped by 95%. Now, let's go back in time again. It's hard to keep track of all this, but we're talking about 1969. Only 17 states had school laws that included, measles vaccination. Then that brings us to Los Angeles, 1977. Dodgers, they didn't win the World Series that year, but they did this year. Thousands of children were getting sick. 2 died. So there was a law saying kids needed to be vaccinated. But what was missing was this enforcement component. So the county health director comes up with a phrase, no shot, no school, which meant tens of thousands of Los Angeles children had to get vaccinated, and there were free clinics before returning to school. And they did. And states around the country looked at this and thought, hey, look, if this school requirement can work in a city like Los Angeles, it can work here. And then by 1980, all 50 states had mandated parents provide proof that their child had received their routine vaccinations in order to attend public school. In other words, like vaccination became the default option. Like that's what you had to do. And researchers can see that this is actually working. In 1977, the incidence of measles in states that had strictly enforced school entry vaccination requirements through this no shot, no school rule was 50% lower than in states that did not enforce such rules. And then a year later, the incidence in the strictly enforced states had dropped to less than 1/10 of that in the other states. And then by 2000, a kind of celebration, if you will. Measles is deemed eliminated in the United States. I mean, if you just pay attention to the news, that is a big deal now because we see the cases happening. And until now, that was true. But this summer, we heard about Texas, but right now we're hearing that America has hit a 34-year high in measles cases in that outbreak emanating from West Texas. And now we're seeing new spikes in other parts of the country. South Carolina made news on Halloween for the number of cases that it had.
Yeah, Mark. And of course, it's not just measles. We have required vaccinations across every state that include MMR, DTaP, polio, and varicella. Some states require hepatitis A or B, meningococcal vaccines, or HPV. But it's really important to note that all states allow for medical exemptions from school vaccine requirements, meaning that if the child has a health issue that prevents them from being vaccinated for safety, they're excused. In addition, 47 states allow exemptions for religious or personal beliefs, and that leaves 4 states, California, Connecticut, Maine, and New York, that only allow for medical exemptions.
Yeah, and enter the medical freedom movement. That's picking up strength over the last 15 years, 20 years even. It's heading to court. It's trying to loosen the public school vaccine mandates across the country. They're especially effective coming out of the pandemic. We're talking groups like Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom. They're very, very organized, very politically effective. And since 2021, state lawmakers have introduced more than 2,500 vaccine-related bills, with almost half of those targeting vaccine requirements. So this is a movement all about giving parents more choice. As we said, it's changing the landscape with these exemptions in states all across the country. And it's also having an effect on our vaccination rates. The most recent CDC data shows us that kindergarten vaccine rates have dropped to about 92%. And that's down from 95% before the pandemic. And remember, 95% is kind of like that magic number. We need to hit that to really create that herd immunity in a community or in a school to protect all the kids.
All right. Do these vaccine mandates even make a difference? And the answer may not be appealing to all, but very simply put, yes. Studies show that in states with a high exemption rate, vaccine coverage tends to be lower and the risk of outbreaks higher. But requiring children to be up to date on vaccine protects those whose immune systems can't tolerate vaccination. We've talked about this kind of social contract. We're talking children who might be undergoing chemotherapy or have an autoimmune disease. For example, we saw the kids testifying in front of their local officials, like, please get vaccinated for me because I can't. Herd immunity from high vaccination rates shields these vulnerable children. It also shields healthy vaccinated kids too, because remember, vaccines are highly effective, but they're not perfect. And we learned that the hard way probably during COVID. It became obvious to everyone. And to illustrate how powerful a tool these mandates can be, just last week, a new JAMA study found that in states that have actually clamped down and eliminated a way for parents to opt out on religious or philosophical grounds, kindergarten vaccination rates went up 2 to 4 percentage points more than in states that kept those exemptions in place. So now our story gets to one state. You've heard about it. We've mentioned it. You've been hearing a lot about all of this, Florida. Florida made headlines when on September 3rd, it announced that it would become the first state to move towards ending state-mandated school vaccine requirements. Now, there's a process, but the state health director has discretion over a bunch of the vaccines and can, in short order, end requirements on those. The state legislator has authority over the rest, and we don't know exactly whether they will get on board with this plan when they're back in session in January. But we all remember the announcement. During the announcement, Florida Surgeon General Dr. Joseph Ladapo said, "Who am I as a government or anyone else? Who am I as a man standing here now to tell you what you should put in your body?" And then in an interview after the announcement, a kind of surprise for a lot of people, the Surgeon General admitted his department did no analysis on how ending vaccine mandates might affect disease outbreaks. He told Jake Tapper, who was on this podcast once, "I don't need to do an analysis on that," which is really quite a remarkable position for the top public health official in the state. So that's what he thinks. But what do Americans think about school mandates? Over the summer, just before Florida's announcement, KFF, the independent research group, found in a survey that they did with the Washington Post that parents overwhelmingly support current laws that require children to be vaccinated against diseases like measles and polio. So KFF has also found that 82% of Florida parents support the school requirements. And then more recently, that Navigator poll we discussed a couple of episodes ago widened out, and among all Americans, so not just parents, 2 in 3 oppose Florida's move to end mandatory vaccination for public schools. So, however, at the same time, you can see cracks. They also found that 46% of Republicans supported what Florida is doing. So, at the same time, KFF found 1 in 6 parents are skipping some childhood vaccines. And we're not talking about COVID or flu shots here.
Yeah, so you have that wide support for this system, but erosion, that skipping, delaying vaccines, that's becoming, an increasing trend. But Florida's not alone. There's also Idaho, which, interestingly is just kind of flying under the radar a bit. So there this spring, the state legislature passed and the governor signed the Idaho Medical Freedom Act, which bars government agencies, businesses, and yes, schools from enforcing vaccine requirements for enrollment. And Idaho has already made some of the most generous exemptions in the country, but local activists pushed for this, got it done, are thrilled about it, and want to model this for the rest of the country. So 120 years after Pastor Jacobson's case, in which the Supreme Court gave states the power to prioritize the health of a community over some individual liberties, we have states like Idaho and soon to be Florida ending that enforcement of vaccination, opting not to use that power. And one final note, a recent CDC report estimates that for U.S. children born between 1994 and 2023, the routine childhood vaccinations have prevented 1.1 million deaths, 32 million hospitalizations, and 508 million cases of illness.
Okay, that is a really good setup to bring on our guest. So, look, it is a great pleasure to welcome Jennifer Reich to Why Should I Trust You? Jennifer is a professor of sociology at the University of Colorado, Denver, and the author of that book that I had said is amazing called Calling the Shots, Why Parents Reject Vaccines. Again, you're going to want to check it out if you haven't already. We love this line from her bio because it's so relevant to today's episode. Jennifer's research explores the intersections between the state and family. So yeah, that's like our episode today, which is school vaccine requirements, state, family, children.
Yep.
Jennifer holds a doctorate in sociology. She's worked extensively in health policy and written about parenting, childhood, public policy, and for the past 20 years has studied vaccine decisions. Jennifer, welcome to Why Should I Trust You?
Thanks so much for having me.
So look, I want to set things up by just kind of one big picture question. Are we thinking about this the right way? On the one hand, you have Surgeon General from Florida, Joseph Ladapo, saying what you put into your body is because of your relationship with your body and God, and the government does not have that right. You've got, Secretary Kennedy basically saying that school requirements are unethical and unscientific, and he says that they're not even medically necessary, and he cites cases like in Sweden where you don't have mandates. And then you've got the American Academy of Pediatrics saying routine childhood immunizations against infectious diseases are an integral part of our public health infrastructure. Look, I know that you support vaccines as just like a thing that works in public health, but are we thinking about this the right way? Are those the polarities about how we should be talking about this?
I mean, I think just to start, you set us up for a great conversation because I think you covered really key aspects. The backdrop to all of this, probably dating back to Jacobson's case and even before, is this question of this sort of teeter-totter, like the seesaw of personal freedom versus collective responsibility. And historically, we can look at the times that we've swung more towards shared responsibility in a community and more towards personal freedom. And we can look, episodically, decade by decade, the way it has continued to switch back and forth. And that's a tension that will be with us forever. I think it shapes almost all of the ways we think about families' experiences every day and what their relationship to the state is, which we don't talk enough about. I think families really, two things are true. And that's really, I think, making this a really interesting and hard conversation right now. We know that mandates are popular, and we know that people depend on each other in a community to be safe, whether it's stopping at traffic lights or, yielding to pedestrians. Like, we rely on each other to follow laws so that everyone's families, everyone's person can be safe. And we also really value our personal freedoms. And that's not entirely uniquely American, but it's absolutely part of our national culture. And so, people bristle at being told they have to do everything exactly the same, everything in lockstep. And so we all navigate that tension every day in our decisions. And when it comes to vaccines, I think it's the most exquisite example of that, because infectious disease is not necessarily a choice that stays within the person who makes the choice, right? Infectious disease, as I think we all learned over the last several years, is beyond individual control. And although lots of people I've spoken to believe that they can recognize when someone's infectious, the truth is you really can't. And, measles is a great example, which is a disease that can stay in a room for over 2 hours after the infected person has left. And so we really can't anticipate our risks in the way that we like. Having said that, I think we also have to acknowledge we are all being increasingly told that we are personally responsible for our own health, and we blame people for their own illnesses all the time culturally. And so it's unsurprising people feel personal responsibility for their own children and their own health and their own nutrition because they don't have a state system that's really looking out for them, which makes it really hard to feel generous, I think, towards communities. And I think that tension right now is really tipped towards the personal over the community is, I think, the moment we're in historically. But I think we can still we can recognize that both halves are true right now.
I remember in your book, Calling the Shots, there was this, I think it was early on, where you were talking about the measles outbreak in Disneyland. And you were like, it was really interesting to me because I've heard this too among some of our listeners from the MAHA movement, that they really kind of bristle at the idea that them deciding not to get a vaccine is like an affront to, the community, and that they're endangering the community. What have you heard in your conversations so that, because look, I'll say for the people who are incredibly in favor of vaccines, there is this very harsh view of people who don't take vaccines. And we saw that during COVID, right? Where people were where even Biden was this is an epidemic of the unvaccinated, you're endangering grandma. What is your experience with talking to people, when somebody tells them, well, you're endangering your community by not doing this?
I think we talk about vaccines like they're all one thing. And, even that 95% threshold for herd immunity is really important for measles. We could probably get by with lower rates for other diseases because it depends how infectious they are. And having said that, there's variation. Some vaccines are entirely for personal benefit, right? Like the tetanus vaccine is miraculous. Tetanus is a terrible, terrible, very hard to treat disease, but it only affects the person. It's not contagious, right? So we vaccinate against it because it's a huge public health issue when it comes up, but it's not something that prevents infection. We have other vaccines that are almost entirely for community benefit, right? So we could take something like the rubella vaccine, which is a not fun disease, but it's not a serious disease for the person infected typically. But it was the leading cause of congenital deafness and disability prior to vaccination when pregnant women were infected. It can, and congenital rubella syndrome was thousands and thousands of babies were born or were not born because of miscarriages. And it was a huge problem. And the vaccine really cured that. But that's a vaccine we give in part to protect others. And we talk about them like they're all one thing. So what I hear over and over again from families I talk to in my research is that if you think vaccines work, you should use them and protect yourself. And if I don't think I need it, why should I have to? And that logic makes sense if you think vaccines are all for personal benefit. We saw this during COVID, right? So when, Brenda, when you highlighted, the statement, like you're out there killing grandma, that's about someone else, right? Like we need young people to be immunized because their immune systems respond better to vaccines than older people respond. And that can save lives. We know this from flu vaccine research, right? The best protection for flu vaccine is actually younger people being immunized because they build a better immune response. But we saw that logic also pivot during COVID, where all of a sudden it became like you needed to protect yourself. We saw this with mask wearing, right? It started out protect other people, and then it rapidly switched to protect yourself. And as long as we think of vaccines as a technology for personal benefit, then it's really hard to argue that we should insist everyone use them, because it should be like, if it's a consumer decision, you all get to make your own consumer decisions. And so parents are often really frustrated when they're told that they're selfish or ignorant or anti-science, because many of the parents I speak with think of themselves as really good people. And you saw this, I think, in the last several episodes with the Maha families you focused on. They volunteer in their community. They care about the environment. They care about food justice, right? They care about a range of social problems. So to say that they're selfish is disingenuous. And that's really, I think, drawn the battle lines here. And so it's a different message, though, to say you're benefiting from other people's immunity, right? Like that you can choose not to vaccinate your children in a community that has 90-some% vaccine rates because your kids are unlikely to encounter a disease. And also, it's really hard to say your child could infect a person who doesn't have the ability to build an immune response because they're too young, they're too old, they're immune compromised, right? They're pregnant. There's another reason that they need you to protect them. That's really different messaging than this is your personal protection. This is your personal shield. But I always try to be empathetic to the fact that parents haven't come up with this by themselves. This has been messaged to them in public health advertisements and pharmaceutical advertisements, right? That like vaccines are what loving parents do for their own children, but not for everyone's children. And they're responding logically, I think, to the cultural frameworks we've put in front of them.
Yeah. We, as you mentioned, like we talked a lot of, people who adhere to the Maha movement. I remember one conversation I had with a Maha mom, and we were talking about nostalgia, which is a very potent force, and it's very potent in Maha. The whole, make America healthy again is nostalgic. And I said, do you ever get nostalgic for the days when people would do things, move out of their comfort zone and do things for the good of the community? Do you miss those days? And do you miss that when it comes to having your child be vaccinated, your healthy child be vaccinated, because there's a kid in the school who's immunocompromised and can't be vaccinated, and you're protecting them? And I remember she thought about it, and she said, that makes me sad, and I feel deeply in my heart for that child and that family. But my job right now as a mom is to my child. And if I think it's unsafe to vaccinate, my first job and my primary job is to protect my child. And for me, that means not vaccinating. I just wonder, as you said, that sort of everything's kind of stacked to lead us to that right now, that this is dangerous. Your job number one is to your child. And can the community argument stand a chance now where we are in 2025?
Yeah, I think this is such an important territory to think about. And one of the things that I really grappled with in writing about, these stories is that as a parent myself, I feel like there's something slightly disingenuous when we talk about herd immunity. At the same time, the herd is doing very little for families. And that when we talk about collective, we ask parents to contribute to the collective. We should be asking what the collective is doing for families. And at this moment today, what are we at the record-breaking government shutdown and the first day that nutritional supplement funds run out, right? We're literally on the territory of not feeding people's children, but blaming them for not participating in community immunity. And I think that's a stark, right, moment. We can think about the divestment in the institutions family rely on. And so I think when you talk to that mom, and not that mom specifically maybe, but many parents, right, they say, if something happens, like, what are you afraid of in a vaccine? Vaccines are better safety monitored than any pharmaceutical product in existence. There is more post-licensing monitoring through multiple data systems, right? Which should be true of all pharmaceutical products and is not in the same way, but we have exquisitely tight monitoring of vaccine safety. And there's great examples of small, tiny safety signals that have led to vaccines being removed from the market. And so, because they were rare but significant events. And so what are you afraid of is a really useful question. Like, why do we think they're unsafe? What do you need to feel safe to be able to do this? And every intervention carries some risk, but the risk is statistically minute compared to, say, antibiotics, which people do not feel unsafe about using. And so how do we make that safe? How do we make families feel supported in believing in the public systems? And I would say, part of it's on the rest of us to up our game about school funding and safety. And what parents grapple with is, if something does happen to my child, if my child somehow becomes disabled, I'm out here by myself, right? And that's real. Like, to say, we would like you to contribute to the collective. Like, I think we have a lot of conversations to have about what the collective can contribute more to families, because I think that this is a reciprocal relationship.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, because if we're just being honest, like, being a good parent today with a child in a school, like, does that mean extracting the most benefit for your child, working the refs, getting the best grades, getting them into the advanced class? Is that what being a good parent in school is today? Like, worrying about your individual child because it's you versus the world and you versus the bureaucracy? Or is being a good parent like volunteering for the PTA, mentoring kids who are, can't afford tutors to get them through math? Like, it just seems like our relationship with school is part of this conversation too.
That is such a good point.
Yeah, right?
I will say in New York City, it definitely feels like the former, people
Yeah.
hiring tutors, coaches for their kid. It's like, having those special meetings with your teacher to make sure that your kid is.
That's like your job, is just to keep working and working to get those opportunities, advantages, whatever you want to call them. It's not about.
What you're
Yeah.
saying is the vaccine conversation, if you choose not to vaccinate, weirdly seems aligned with this, like, I'm really trying to provide the best education and life for my kid.
It's the only prism I feel like people look at school through.
Jennifer,
They
what
don't
do you
look
think
at
about
it.
that?
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have two, like, as a sociologist, right? I mean, I'm less interested in, like, do parents know all the facts, and more like, what's the surrounding circumstances and culture that we've set up for parents, and how do people respond to the circumstances in which they find themselves in? And we've really set in motion since the 1980s two logics. One that says you are entirely personally responsible for your own health, and you should count your calories, count your steps, take up jogging, get a wearable, right? Which, whatever it is, you are personally responsible for your health outcomes. And when someone gets sick, we always, like, I think everyone's like, well, they had a really healthy lifestyle. That seems unfair. Or, wow, they ate fast food every day. It must be their own fault, right? Like, we jump to the logics of individualism. And the second is around parenting. Like, what are the pressures placed on parents? And we could take something like school choice, which sounds like personal liberty, but what it says essentially is that it's okay if some kids have failing schools as long as your kids don't have to go to them. Parents overwhelmingly fear their kids will be downwardly mobile, that life is hard for them, and that their children are in competition with other people's children. And there's very little cultural messaging that we are responsible for each other's families, right? That, like, we should make sure all kids are okay. And that's not about vaccines, right? That's about almost everything in culture. And you're highlighting all the ways it's actually normalized. I think it's valorized that if you can afford opportunities, you should buy them for your children, rather than asking the question about who's locked out of those systems. And so if you take those two logics, you can ask the question, like, how have we gotten to a place where 20 to 30% of American parents are deliberately spacing and customizing their vaccine schedule? Those two logically, I think it's really logical that they've gotten to this place that they say, why should I do exactly the same thing as everyone else's families if I think there's ways that I can optimize a vaccine schedule? And, we know that most families are not rejecting all vaccines, but we do know that a sizable number of families are customizing their schedules. They're skipping some, they're spacing them. I've talked to physicians who are designing custom vaccine schedules for people in their practices on a cash-only basis because it feels personal. And we've really oversold individualism in healthcare and personalized medicine in ways that are, I think, a beautiful story that are undeliverable in reality. And yet people expect that kind of personal touch. And I hear all the time, vaccines are a one-size-fits-all strategy that doesn't apply to my child in my family with my lifestyle. And I've even talked to families who create different vaccine strategies for every child in their family based on how they perceive their own children's specialized needs and vulnerabilities. And when we think about that within the context of schools, or we think about it in the context of other ways, right, this personalization infuses all institutions children touch. And so it's unsurprising that vaccines are another part of that.
I think everybody thinks they know what sociology is until you actually talk to a sociologist. Who you're really opening up our eyes into just different ways of thinking about the same issue. I want to turn a little bit into just how did we get here? You mentioned the government shutdown and kind of the downstream effects of some of that. But, where is all of this coming from? Because if you just look at it as like, from a political side, I mean, politics alone can't explain all of this. I mean, 3/4 of Republican parents say public schools should require vaccines. Even 73% of Make America Great Again movement believes this. So how did this become such a flashpoint? Like from a sociology perspective, like what did you learn? You talked to 64 sets of parents, or what did you learn that gets us here?
I'm so glad you asked this. And you had such a lovely, I think, full history at the beginning of this show. And so to kind of fill in some of those spaces, right, you mentioned that starting 1981 was the first year that every state had a requirement for a school vaccine verification in order to attend schools and childcare settings. And, one of the things we forget is those laws only started being passed in the 1960s. And some of that was because the polio vaccine was licensed in the 1950s, and it was highly desirable. The field study was actually paid for by what became the March of Dimes, which was like people dropping literally dimes in jars at movie theaters. 90% of Americans knew about the Fields trials and were invested in them. They were lining up school children and with an untested vaccine because people were so terrified of polio and so believed in the potential of science. And I think if we think about the 1950s, we can think about the beginning of the space race, the creation of antibiotics, right? Like the cultural belief that science could solve problems is like very much the framework here. But when the vaccine became licensed, there were huge arguments over who should get it because there was never going to be enough to meet demand. And there was a tension between whether it should just be people who could pay for it, whether the government should be involved in it. And these were really robust arguments that continued through the licensing of the measles vaccines. What is the role of the government in deciding this? And I'll say physicians were opposed to the government being involved. They thought there shouldn't be any prohibitions, that they should be able to decide which paying customers should get it. The pharmaceutical organizations opposed government involvement. And yet it was really clear low-income kids didn't have any access. And so, Kennedy was key in setting up the first funding at a federal level. And the relationship has always been the federal government could fund vaccines to be distributed to the states. They could arrange purchasing agreements, but they would never tell states how to give them out. And so even when the ACIP was formed in the 1960s as an advisory group to CDC, they set the recommendations, but it's always up to the state to decide which vaccines to give. And not all states require the same vaccines, even when they have a requirement. So as states started to get on board, in part to access federal funding, there was consensus that this was really important, right? That this was a solution. And so as states started to sign on and pass their own laws, and by 1981, every state had a law, having a law is not the same as having enforcement. So we use them interchangeable sometimes, but they're really not. And from go, this was going to be a problem, right? Because you can have a law, but you're asking schools to be the enforcer of public health law. And schools are incentivized to have children in chairs. Sometimes their funding depends on having the kids in the chairs if they're a state with average daily attendance as their calculation. But philosophically, teachers and schools want children in schools learning. And the idea that they would be responsible for excluding children for non-participation was a mismatch from the beginning. At the same time, public health agencies are not entitled to look at school records under other federal protections, right? That the education rights under FERPA are not open to public health agencies necessarily unless the states have decided they are. And so from the very beginning, this enforcement question was going to be messy. And we talked about Florida. Florida announced during the first measles cases, and they've done this in the past, that there would be no enforcement, even if the law says you're supposed to not go to school. If there's an outbreak and you're unimmunized, Florida said they won't enforce it, right? So the enforcement and the laws have always been separate, and they should dovetail, but they don't necessarily always dovetail. What's important in our story, though, is in the mid-1980s, we start seeing a group of parents talk to each other about their sense that their children were harmed by the whole-cell pertussis vaccine. And that really leads to a public conversation that vaccines are maybe not always safe, that there might be a dark side to it, that they were overpromised by physicians and that no one acknowledged that there could be any risk. And that really started a conversation amongst parents. At the same time, we see AIDS activism and ACT UP pushing back on the FDA. We see other social movements. The women's health movement through the 1960s and 70s was really influential in pushing back on medical expertise. And so we see the ways that families start asking questions. It's a cultural moment as we're moving towards more personal responsibility. And then if we fast forward from the 1980s to where we are now, I think one of the things going back to measles at Disneyland in 2014 is that California was the first state to remove their personal belief and religious belief exemptions from law. Until then, only West Virginia and Mississippi were the only two states that didn't have exemptions in their laws other than medical exemptions. And for a long time, I thought it was really fun to think about California, West Virginia, and Mississippi as the only three states doing the same thing because it was so unlikely. But as California removed their exemptions, they sort of set a model that other states, New York, Connecticut, Maine, followed. And it seemed at the time there was this cheering, like, see, we've made it harder to get an exemption. We've forced more families in. It's clear it worked. California has the lowest exemption rate in the country now. And that for people who don't feel strongly, the requirements often get them to go to the doctor and deal with something that's a hassle. Right. It's not for the ideologically strongly opposed. It's the people who just need to be nudged towards it that makes the hugest difference. And then, so that law went into effect in 2016, 2017, and COVID's only a few years later. So there's already, I think, this tension between, do we allow people to do whatever they want? Or do we not give them enough choices? And I would say the exemption system since the very beginning has been a steam valve for this problem. So that people want, two things are true. They want mandates and they want exemptions from those mandates. And that's an interesting conversation, right? That nobody wants the mandates to go away, or not nobody, right? But you can see the majority of people do not want mandates to go away, and they want exemptions from those mandates. And so I would say that when states started tipping towards reducing the availability of exemptions, and then COVID happened, which for a lot of families felt like a really heavy-handed repression of their freedom to move through the world. Schools did not reopen, even though other institutions like bars and restaurants were. California closed its beaches, which, and we can all look historically and say, like, that probably wasn't the best idea once we understood outdoor transmission, right? Like, we could think about the ways that the frustration with the state, that relationship to the state, became really complicated, and I would say has now tipped to a direction where we are today, right? Where there's more movement towards expanding exemptions, but not necessarily getting rid of mandates completely, but also those laws that you mentioned at the beginning, those 2,500 different bills, many of them are just restrictions on the ability of public health agencies to respond to emergencies.
Throw in the price of eggs and you have a perfect storm.
But let me ask you this question, because just channeling our MAHA listeners, and just tell me, Jennifer, if you agree or disagree with this statement. As a parent, I have the right to determine what goes into my child's body.
Absolutely.
Right. Period. So isn't that end of story?
Yes.
Right.
But the question is though, do you also then have the right to participate in public systems? Right.
I have a right to public access to public health, public school. So you're taking away
No, you have a right to public education.
public
Which
education.
is different, right? So when we say like I can choose, we don't have a system of mandatory vaccination in this country. No one
Right.
goes to your doors and
Right.
requires it, right?
But I could homeschool, right? I mean, that's
You have alternatives, right? And so there's online schooling, there's homeschooling, right? You have the right to alternatives. The question is, if we require education, which we do, and this, again, like other Supreme Court cases have said, yes, you're allowed to require education because we all rely collectively on an educated population. Going into a schoolhouse is a high-risk activity for infectious disease. So if you are meeting your legal obligation to educate for your children to be educated, should they also be risking their life to do so? And the answer is no, right? That if you are participating in public education and we are investing in public education, the return on investment is that you participate in public systems, right? And if you choose not to participate in public systems, that's okay. But it may foreclose your opportunities to participate in those same public systems.
This gets back to expertise.
Let me jump in with something, because I think what Jennifer is saying about this world of people are in favor of mandates, but they also want exemptions is like a fascinating thing that I really want to dig into. Help me understand this, Jennifer, because what you're basically saying is the one size fits all is one way of approaching allowing people to come into a public school. But you're suggesting that exemptions existing may not necessarily harm the mandates. Like, can you help me? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Can we work in a world with exemptions being commonplace?
So exemptions are really interesting, right? And we have lots of research on how they work and don't work. We know in states that it's easier to get an exemption. You're more likely to use the exemption process. So it's not that they're not related. I'm in Colorado. When I started studying vaccine decision-making, Colorado led the nation in the per capita use of exemptions. And we have personal belief exemptions and religious exemptions on top of medical exemptions. But part of it was that to exercise your exemption, you just had to sign a form and then turn it in, which is a way easier process than actually making a doctor's appointment, taking your children, submitting the paperwork to the school. So a lot of folks and states have looked at the exemption process and said, let's at least equalize how much work it is, right? So many states have added an education module. Many require you to recertify every year. Some states require you to notarize your exemption form. And the harder it is to exercise the exemption, the less likely it is people are going to use it. And so they're not unrelated, right? We know states with easier exemptions have higher use of exemptions. So that's true. And still having a mandate does create an opportunity for conversation with families. And the bottom line is most families don't oppose vaccines, right? We know that, unequivocally, over 80% of families of Americans say that they believe childhood vaccines are important, unequivocally, right? But then the question is, the way we distribute them has made people uncomfortable. The dosage, the scheduling of them has made people uncomfortable. And there's many things that I find fascinating that feel intuitively true that may not be scientifically entirely true. So one example, I hear all the time, there's too many vaccines. And keeping in mind, most parents today were fully immunized themselves and didn't have an issue, right? So why do they feel so uncomfortable? And they frequently say to me, well, the vaccine schedule today is totally different than the one we had as kids. And it's true. It's much more complex and there's many more infectious diseases on it. When I ask vaccine researchers, why shouldn't parents feel unsafe? They say, our process of manufacturing is so much better. We are so much more able to isolate proteins that the entire childhood vaccine may have fewer proteins than one polio vaccine in the 1950s because the way vaccines are manufactured, the precision with which we can isolate proteins or even mimic proteins that aren't grown on animal tissue anymore might be so much safer and better. And that's interesting, and it feels not reassuring to families, right, to parents.
Particularly since they don't trust the manufacturers for all those reasons, right? Because of the opioid crisis, because of just the pharmaceutical, the relationship that people have with big pharma in this country.
Absolutely. And we're facing, a moment where the sources of reassurance should be federal regulation and safety testing and inspections of factories. And right now we're getting mixed messaging. You could say, why are we giving vaccines in combination? That just intuitively feels unsafe. There's good evidence that sometimes giving vaccines in combination may get a better immune response. And that's fallen out of the conversation. The other thing is, we frequently rely on that the safer path is to wait and see. and that doing less is safer than doing more. And that feels true. And we know it's not true with asthma medications. We know it's not true with insulin, right? We know it's not true with a range of other medical things, but it feels true. The other thing that I think is really interesting is I frequently heard from families that the vaccine schedule isn't tailored to individuals, and that why is the same vaccine given to an 8-pound baby and a 200-pound football player? And that to me, that seemed like an interesting question. And so I investigated it. I asked researchers, I asked folks, and they said, we have to remember vaccines are not medications. They don't have a volume of distribution. They don't have dosage in the same way. They're more of an immune trigger. Like if you sneeze on a baby and you sneeze on a 200-pound football player, they might not get differentially sick, right? And so to think about their immune triggers, not medications, is not how we think about these, as we think about them as pharmaceutical products, the same as other medications. And so there's things where I'm like, as a parent, I can see the logic in it. I can feel the logic in it. And having a little tiny baby who's being acted on feels terrible. But it's also really interesting to think about the counterpoint. And I often try to keep in mind that vaccines are a technology of containment, right? They are asking parents to weigh two hypotheticals: the hypothetical risk of an adverse reaction and the hypothetical risk of an infection. And both are unknown and unknowable. And so parents are really grappling with which sounds scarier to me. The risk of an infection that may or may never happen, depending wild virus polio really hasn't been seen in the U.S. since the 1970s, against the risk of an adverse reaction, which I see from lots of parent narratives is terrifying. And how do I weigh these two things? And for sure, parents overestimate the risk of an adverse reaction and underestimate the severity of infection. But they are wearing two things that aren't happening right now, which is really different than a treatment. So when I say antibiotics are way more risky, they're treating an actual infection, and parents are willing to absorb more risk for an actuality than a hypothetical. And that's a really hard conversation to be having, I think, also, that we don't spend enough time thinking through.
Do you also find, Jennifer, that as a public health kind of collective, public health people are really not psyched to talk about vaccine adverse events? It's not something that people, because it's rare and because there's this understanding that or there's this assumption that if people do that, it will make people not want to take the vaccine. I remember when, Tom and I were at ABC News and we would do tons of stories about airbags, right? And how airbags are there to keep you safe. But then how many stories do we do, Tom, about airbags that killed somebody, right? And if they blow up and they hit somebody in the face, it could cause injury. What is the fear of talking about vaccine adverse events? Is it really that this sense that if you talk about them, people won't take them? It's not like talking about airbags means people won't drive cars. Help me understand, because I've really noticed this shift in somebody's presentation in a way when the phrase vaccine adverse event comes up when you're talking to doctors.
I think historically we can look at the medical profession and the confidence, right? That there hasn't been a lot of acknowledgement, I think, in all sorts of ways of just nuance, right? That the expertise, right? The story that vaccines are always safe and always effective is really powerful. The data you gave at the beginning about just the sheer volume of babies and lives that have been saved, right? It's just so obvious that it's important. As we've moved towards this more personalization, right? This more individualized approach to health, it's what I think a lot of families are asking for, which is really hard to deliver, is if we know adverse reactions are really rare, why can't we predict who has them? Right. And I frequently hear these calls for why can't we do a double-blind study? How come we can't, show? And the belief is that there's something within an individual that's not currently known, but that must be an explanation. And if only we could find this genetic thing, we could always find whatever we could find, this predisposition to an adverse reaction, that would make it clearer who should and shouldn't get vaccinated. And we have some examples of certain underlying health conditions that might not be great with vaccination. But in general, it's a really hard, needle to find in a haystack, if there even is such a thing. And I'll say separately, we've probably oversold the importance of genetic determinism in a lot of spaces too. What's worth noting is that the majority of adverse reactions today are in adults, not children. And when we look at data from the Vaccine Claims Court, for example, the majority are related to flu vaccine. They're related to a lot of seniors. They're not real, like we intended the system for childhood illnesses, and there's very few claims made in the childhood system. So then it becomes this diffuse thing. And what I see parents doing is they customize for each child in their family. Is many families feel like, well, my child already has eczema or asthma or allergies, so I already feel like their immune system is not operating optimally. Therefore, I don't want to act on the immune system, right? I already feel like this child is more vulnerable, or that there would be a trigger. I heard that a lot. Like the vaccine might be the one thing that triggers a worse outcome for a child who's already struggling with a learning disability or something else, right? The sense that there's some predisposition that should be knowable but isn't makes parents feel like they have to do their own assessment. Now, is there a scientific answer to this question? Is a much harder one, right? Like, how do we understand rare events? How do we understand predictions on a particular day? And I think about that with infection also. How do we explain that one of the children who died of measles was part of a household where every child in the family had measles and one child died and the others recovered, right? Like, how do we explain that also?
Were all the kids unvaccinated in the family, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're talking about
And
in
so,
Texas, right?
Texas, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Brenda, to answer your question about that, I think it's like the public health versus like health. I mean, you go to the doctor and, in medicine, like we don't lead with fear. We lead with hope, with possibility, with, how can I help you? We don't open the door with like the side effects. Like you have to understand what the vaccine is going to do for you. And then you can, pivot to side effects as you're like nuancing that decision. And I think that's really this like difference between public health and like health.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, Mark, it's like in that conversation with a doctor, you're absolutely right. And I think that is where that conversation about adverse events does come up. I'm talking about like when we bring someone on the show or like I'm at a conference or just like somebody's really mad at Kennedy and they're like, why is it? That's the space where I feel like so many people in public health are really hesitant to acknowledge adverse events because they think it's somehow giving into a narrative that is false. And my thing is simply like, it's not false. It's just, and by saying it's
Brenda,
false.
I might push back on that as a person in public health. I don't feel like mentioning vaccine adverse events is, they're not false. We've been talking about them. I feel like there's fear talking about it because we feel like it's been hyped up in people's minds that risk is very well known compared to the risk of an infection, the risk of a post-viral syndrome, and other risks. And so for a long time, it was just don't engage, don't bring it up. But we all acknowledge there were risks. Guillain-Barré syndrome has been well documented for a long time. As Jennifer said, we know the risk profile for vaccines because we have all this safety data. And we don't have that safety data for like anything else.
I'd say that people from Maha would not agree with that statement who listen to our show. I think they would feel like that we don't center the conversation around adverse events, like that public health doesn't do that.
Well, we shouldn't. That's what they'd say. We shouldn't center it around adverse events because adverse events
you're absolutely
are
right.
so small.
Center is the wrong word. I absolutely agree with you. I think we don't even really have it. I think it's one thing to say that like they exist on pamphlets and things like that, but it's another thing to say that like, I mean, for the most part, public health are like vaccines are the underpinning of public health. These are really rare. They don't sit and talk about the adverse events.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Public health, I mean, we're stereotyping, but I think public health would say, it's been weaponized like these adverse effects to sort of take down to challenge vaccines and the goodness of vaccines. And so they are hesitant to talk about it. And that hesitance comes through people see that and then it's suddenly like, what are they hiding? Look at this revelation. There's going to be like where there's smoke, there's fire. It's feeding this fear that it's not being talked about and being swept under the rug. And then why is it being swept under the rug? And I think you're right that if public health just said, you want to talk about that? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about adverse effects, but let's put them in the proper, Dr. Mark, Dr. Maggie context.
We need a sociologist. I really think it's time for a sociologist to come in because I think we need help on our own show about this.
I have a question. A lot of what you've been describing of parents today, you use the word feel, like this feels right, this feels wrong. that feels good. It's like a lot of feeling. And I think, is that a product of the breakdown in trust? Like, I don't know the science. I depend on an expert to tell me the science. But you're describing parents who are feeling a lot of things and making decisions based on their feelings and their intuition. Is that a product of our breakdown in trust?
I would say it's actually a product of expert advice. So I went back to 1970s parenting books, and it turns out Dr. Spock told parents to trust their intuition, right? Like parenting books, mothers are told to write a birth plan for a thing they've never done before based on what's important to them, what's value aligned, right? And healthcare has really grappled, and I'd say pediatrics as a discipline, as a specialty, has really grappled with, they have two mandates in their documents. One is that they are like guardians of public health, and the other is that they are partners with their patients. And, doing both things can be really hard. And so I would say that actually, as we've individualized health, we've really asked people to rely on their own sense of truth. There's parts of me that don't mind that, right? We can think of a lot of examples historically where patient advocacy groups have improved medicine. They've improved healthcare. Speaking out about my lived experience of a disease has often changed people's disease treatment plans, right? We know examples where patients speaking back is really important to improving systems. And I don't know that vaccines are totally different than that. As parents have been talking about what's important to them, I think there's opportunities to speak back. I will say amongst pediatrics, it's really divisive. There's a disagreement about what is the role of a pediatrician in caring for families who don't vaccinate. Some doctors really believe that if you don't trust me, we can't have a treatment relationship. I've talked to doctors who are positive that babies got whooping cough in their waiting room because they had unvaccinated families who brought it in, and it turns out the fish tank is not the great container of infectious disease with the wellness side and the sick side in most doctors' offices that people, promised. And there's doctors who just say, like, I can't have them in my practice. And I've talked to other pediatricians who say, I can do a lot of things for families besides vaccines, right? I can do developmental screenings. I can support nutrition. I can support lifestyle. I can support a lot of things that matter. And that's important to maintain. I think it's really clear most families don't think of vaccines as a one and done decision, right? That many parents see this as a strategic process of deploying vaccines at times they feel necessary. So I spoke with families who don't have any vaccines for their children now, but they acknowledge that as their plans change, as their life changes, as their family's health changes, they reconsider this, whether it's traveling internationally. I remember one mother said her son wants to be a missionary and that they'll have to rethink this again. I saw a family that was heading to a meditation retreat in India, and they suddenly thought vaccines seemed like a good idea. Like thinking about like how do people's circumstances, they have a immune compromised family member, they have a family getting a bone marrow transplant, that may change their strategies. And so, that doesn't change the fact that those children are unprotected for many more years. It doesn't change the fact that the vaccines might be most important at the same ages that families feel less comfortable with them, that babies are more likely to be significantly affected. But it does mean that they see them as a kind of strategic tool and not a universal public health system, right? And that's the way most families, not even that, 19% of families who are uncomfortable, but this is like something that we see 20-30% of parents doing. I think that puts it back on healthcare providers to really think about, are all vaccines equally important at every visit? Are there ways of doing kind of a harm reduction approach to thinking about what's important, what's not important today, and really parsing them out in a way that I don't know that pediatricians historically have been trained to do because it hasn't been part of the cultural conversation.
Jennifer, you mentioned, I can't, if I'm a pediatrician, I might say something like, if you don't trust me, I can't take care of you. I mean, we keep going back to this like trust. The name of our show is, why should I trust you? But is trust even like from a sociology perspective? You have the part of our brain that's thinking social contract. You have the part of our brain thinking that's individual choice. You must have like figured out another part of the brain. Please tell me if you figured it out. But is trust even the right word for like what society needs to have in science? Like, how can we relate to science? It's so vast. It's like, it's so technical. It's like, it's abstract for so many people. Like, right. Is this like the right word? Like, are we just like so on another planet here? Like, how can you expect me to trust the science?
So I love this question. And I think you all grapple with this, all the time. And so I think it's really important. I don't think trust is a particularly useful concept in this conversation. And here's why. There's folks who trust, quote unquote, trust science, who do not live perfect American Academy of Pediatric Lives. They don't live evidence-based science. I tend to confess frequently that I really like ice cream, but I am not confused about the nutritional properties of ice cream, right? It is not a health literacy problem. It's not a misinformation problem, but it aligns with something, right? The way your grandmother makes food is really important to you, whether or not it's nutritionally optimal. You know, thinking about like the ways we all make decisions. It's not that any of us are confused on the dangers of texting while driving, and yet we know many very educated, scientifically expertise people do things that are not evidence-based, right? So health literacy is not the problem. Lack of trust is, I don't think, is entirely the problem. But it's, I think, a lack of alliance between values and experiences and priorities, right? When we think about how we put those together. And I keep coming back to the mom Tom talked to, right? Who's like, at the end of the day, my child is my priority. And I would add on to that, and I don't see a lot of support elsewhere, right? And so you can understand all of the science. And I would say a lot of the families I talk to are not confused on the science of vaccines. I think about this one mother a lot who talks about how she doesn't really care about rubella for her sons because they'll never be pregnant. But she feels really strongly that if by 13 they haven't seen mumps, she might consider a vaccine because it could cost sterility for them. That's not an unscientific perspective, right? That is grounded in exactly who experiences the worst outcomes of infection. The problem is she doesn't think of her children as part of a chain reaction in a community, or that her son might be partnered with someone who is pregnant or might be at the grocery store with someone who is pregnant and be a transmitter. But that's not the way we talk about parenting, right? Our children are the locus of it. And is that a lack of trust? I don't think so. The other thing I'd add, which is not quite what you asked, but I think it's worth acknowledging, is that there's so much focus on misinformation, which I think is a really disempowering way of talking about how people make decisions. And so the idea that we're all little sponges and you encounter one thing on Instagram or the algorithm pushes information to you and you soaked it up and now you won't vaccinate feels like a pure story. And I think it alleviates the responsibilities of public health experts and others to communicate where parents are. But the answer is like, it may help us overestimate the risk of an adverse reaction or underestimate the risk of infection. Like it may change our perceptions, but it's not how we make decisions. And I think we have to kind of think through the way and like be honest, like public health experts are not, I've interviewed pediatricians who don't fully vaccinate their own children in my research. It is not like an us versus them in this. We're all engaged in figuring out how to come up with daily strategies to get through the world as safely as we can.
So if we're all doing that and all parents are kind of gravitating towards that, or not all parents, but many parents are gravitating towards that, of these individualized decisions, yes on this, no on that, put that off, we'll see, I don't think my child needs that. Do the vaccine school requirements survive? What do you think?
You know, we should acknowledge, I think, that even people who fully vaccinate their kids are not exactly excited about it a lot of the times, right? There's a certain amount of anxiety and ambivalence too, right? That even when we fully participate, we can feel uncomfortable with things. Do mandates survive is a great question. I'm increasingly fascinated, and I think this came up with one of your recent, things about like just the number of people who want healthcare to be better across the partisan divide, who want better systems, who want to feel good about their food inspectors. I think we have some bipartisan moments that I can't understand why no one's, it doesn't feel like anyone's capitalizing on them right now. And I do wonder, if we look at, I'm sad that COVID didn't become one of those opportunities for us. This was much like polio, vaccine science that was developed by the people for the people. We paid for that science as a community, right? We invested in that science. Our government funded that science. It was also closely watched. I used to look daily at the New York Times tracker of the 26 or 32 vaccine studies that were happening and watch some fall away for lack of evidence and others succeed, and watch really closely the arguments about what level of efficacy would be good enough and how would we decide. And the people knew about that vaccine in the same way they knew about the polio trials. And there was an opportunity in my mind that we missed to say, this is something we built together, and the people should own and control it. And that's not what happened in the end. It became highly partisan. Control was turned back to the companies to price it in whatever way they saw as reasonable, right? There was a lot of ways that we had an opportunity to collectively do something in this moment. And we saw a lot of generosity during COVID. We saw people buy groceries for each other. We saw people protect the seniors in their neighborhood, right? We saw a lot of people really looking out for each other. And there was, I think, an opportunity to think, how could we come together and help each other? And we went a different direction. And I think that's where we live now, is this different moment about coming back to like, what is the role of the state in my daily life? And if I experience the state as oppressive and I experience it as inequitable, it's going to be really hard to feel generous. And if I think it's a tool to make everyone's children safe and healthy, including mine, it's going to be a lot easier to buy in. And so I don't know how long this little moment is going to last, but I'm looking forward to the time when we have another dose of like forward-facing optimism instead of backwards-looking nostalgia, right? I think that's going to be really important as I think about possibilities in health and communities.
Jennifer, what I'm hearing you say, in this fault line of discussing a harm reduction model and an individualized, like a personalized approach to health, feels like, holy shit, there's infectious diseases out there. How can we customize everyone? But at the same time, that is in fact how we live our lives these days. And that on some level, we have to acknowledge that. And maybe we can hold many of these things to be true. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, and it'll be great if you all are part of lowering the temperature on these conversations, right? Because I think what you see in your polling data and what you see in these conversations is everyone wants healthy children, right? Everyone wants wildly successful communities that are free of disease and infection and malnutrition and homelessness. Like we have a lot of common things we want in our communities. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities also to think about, if we think about mandates as a tool of like making sure we have healthy communities, what does it mean to get people to buy into that vision without feeling vulnerable or oppressed or unsafe? And I think those are conversations that we probably collectively need to start having more of, including like I try to acknowledge why I immunize my children, not because I have to, but because like, how did I decide this? How do I have an immune compromised family member? How did I make this decision? How do I acknowledge that there might be minute risk, but my kids are healthy and they can handle that, right? Like, how do I do this as a parent? And I think there's opportunities also for people who do immunize to explain the process by which they decided, and it should be better than I was told to, so I did it.
Boom. Oh my goodness. Jennifer, the wisdom bombs you've been dropping left and right. I'm going to be processing this episode for hours to come. So Jennifer Reich, sociologist, author of Calling the Shots. Please order it immediately. One of my favorite books. Thank you so much for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
I'm so honored to be here. Thanks so much.
So that was our episode. Please send questions and comments to questions@whyshouldItrustYou. Check us out on Substack. Leave us a like, rate, comment, review, all that good stuff. Tell a friend, tell your moms, tell your pops. I'm Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. She is Maggie Bartlett. He is Dr. Mark Abdul Malik. That was Jennifer Reich. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you right back here next week.